Today we're starting a new unit on innovation and experimentation, and at least with today's topic, you are going to see some overlap from last week. Last week we looked at the Sistine Chapel and the Mona Lisa, which are artworks from the Renaissance. Today we're going to focus on the Renaissance in general because we're going to talk about some key innovations that began in the Renaissance that were groundbreaking for the art world.
I mean, these things were so important that even to this day, we still use all of the techniques that were developed during the Renaissance.
So the Renaissance took place, rough dates, 13 to 1600. Mostly we're going to be talking about the 14 to 1500s. Like we said last week, Renaissance means rebirth. So it was a rebirth of culture and a rediscovery of the classical periods of Greek and Roman art.
So this primarily started in Florence in Italy and then spread throughout the rest of the country, and eventually it took hold throughout Europe. Different places in Europe kind of have slightly different styles during the Renaissance, but you'll see a lot of the inventions that came from Italy ended up spreading throughout Europe. So the main artists that we're going to be looking at for this is Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Raphael, and Botticelli. I mean, there's many others. There are so many famous artists, but of course, we tend to focus on our, quote, Ninja Turtles because those are the most famous examples for sure.
So in the Renaissance, painting is going to be the main type of art being created. There was also a lot of sculpture being made. I know I touched last week on Michelangelo creating the Pietà and the David. There were other things going on, but we're going to focus today on painting and these kind of innovations or new type of art inventions that were created during the Renaissance that really helped propel their work to a new level.
So this whole unit is about experimentation and innovation, and artists had to really play around with and experiment with all of these techniques in order to perfect them and to understand them, the first of which being perspective. So before the Renaissance, whenever artists were trying to convey depth of space, often you would find that the exterior of buildings is kind of weird and they look like lopsided or tilted. It just didn't look very realistic. So the invention of perspective and linear perspective especially helped to convey realistic buildings, interiors. We see this a lot in the School of Athens by Raphael. We also see this in The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, where the architecture that's in the scene is extremely realistic.
So that was the first invention of the Renaissance. The second, and we touched on this last week, is oil paint. So oil paint helped create much brighter colors and really heighten the realism. And then another thing that y'all may not know about oil paint is that it really takes a long time to dry. So before this, they were using tempera, and that just dried so quickly they couldn't work on paintings as long. So they were almost kind of hurried, I guess you could say, when they were working on paintings. But with oil paint, it has such a long dry time that they were able to really perfect their skills, and artists could work on paintings for weeks and weeks, if not months, and it really helped them to focus a lot more on creating three-dimensionality within their work, showing more realistic textures, and then once again showing these brighter colors.
The next major invention in terms of painting has to do with composition, and it's the pyramidal composition. This was used by artists in order to create balance and harmony by arranging things into this sort of triangular format where most of the weight is at the bottom, and then there's less visual weight at the top. And so it does create this sort of pyramid structure, which they thought was extremely balanced and harmonious, and it just sort of gave the impression of everything being whole and perfect and stable.
The fourth and final invention of the Renaissance is called chiaroscuro, which is just a fancy Italian word for using lights and darks. So it's just shading. That's really all it is. Something we need to kind of touch on is that prior to the Renaissance, there's this big lull in between the end of the Roman Empire and kind of the Renaissance in the art world. In the medieval times, the art was just not great. It was very flat and didn't show a lot of detail, proportions were off, and so that's why the Renaissance was considered just amazing. You can see some of these examples, early Christian art, and see medieval times, just very flat with their figures. And so chiaroscuro really helped to show the three-dimensionality, once again, mostly of figures, because you're going to see paintings of lots and lots of people, really making these people pop off of the page.
Those early medieval examples are all lacking a lot of those things. And it's not that they didn't necessarily know how, but the focus during that time was deeply religious. And in a way, if you made your art too good, it was seen as self-absorbed and like you were missing the whole point of the artwork, which was to honor God. So now in the Renaissance, artists are being given a little bit more freedom to really show off their technical skill.
And they did that very well through a lot of artwork that is still very famous today.